The room seemed to huddle in a little. They sat in the quiet. After a while, Jeff got up and headed for the bar again. "Get you another?" Norton shook his head. "Got to get back. Get up early." "You're not going to stay the night?" "Well, Jesus, Tom. Do we get along that badly?" Jeff turned from the drink he was pouring and nailed him with a look. "Come on. There's no fucking way you'll get a ferry back across at this time of night. Are you really going to ride a taxi all the way around the bay just so you don't have to sleep under my roof?" "Jeff, it's not—" "Tom, I know I can be an asshole sometimes. I know that. I know there are things about me you don't approve of, things you think Mom and Dad wouldn't approve of. But Christ, you think the old man's been a saint his whole fucking life?" "I don't know," Norton said quietly. "But if he wasn't, none of us ever caught him." "You didn't catch me. I fucking told you about it." "Yeah, thanks for that." "Tom, I'm your brother, for Christ's sake. Who got you that fucking job at Colin in the first place?" Norton shot to his feet. "I won't believe that. Tell Megan and the kids I said hi. Sorry I didn't have time to get them a gift." "Tom, wait. Wait!" Hands out, placating, drink forgotten. "I'm sorry, that was a bitchy crack. All right, look, I didn't get you your job. You were well up the list for it anyway. But I spoke well of you in a lot of ears that summer, and I'd do it again. You're my brother. Don't you think that means something to me?" "Megan's your wife. Doesn't that mean something to you?" "Christ, it's not the same. She's a woman, not... He stopped, gestured helplessly. "It's married life, Tom. That's how it works. You get kids, you get tired, the gloss comes off. You go looking for something. I don't know, something fresh, something to remind you that you're not dead yet, that you're not turning into two harmless little old people in a Costa Rican retirement complex. That's how you see Mom and Dad? That's how they are, Tom. You should get down there more often. You'd see that. Maybe then you'd start to understand." "Yeah, right. You fucked one of your Bonobo refugee clients because Mom and Dad are old. Makes a lot of sense." "Tom, you got no fucking idea what you're talking about. You're 37 years old. You've never been married. You don't have a family. I mean—" Jeff seemed to be straining to reach something inside himself. "Look, do you really think Megan would care that much if she knew? I mean, sure, she'd go through the motions, the emotions. She'd make me move out for a while. There'd be a lot of crying. But in the end, Tom, she'd do what's best for the kids. They're her world now, not me. I couldn't break her heart anymore, even if I wanted to, even if I tried. It's genetics, Tom, fucking genetics. I'm secondary to the kids for Megan because that's the way she's wired. And you fucked Nu Ying because that's just the way you're wired, right?" Jeff puffed out a breath, looked down, spread his hands up from his sides. "Pretty much, yeah. My wiring and hers. Nu, I'm talking about. I'm the big alpha male around the foundation, the patriarch and the most expensive suit in sight. For a bonobo, that's a bullseye bigger than Larry Lastman's dick. So you just obligingly stepped into range, right? Just couldn't bear to disappoint the girl." Another sigh. This time Norton heard in it how the fight had gone out of his brother. Jeff dropped back into his seat, looked up. "Okay, Tom," he said quietly. "Have it your own way. I guess you've probably never fucked a bonobo in your life either, so you don't know how that feels. All that submission, all that broken flower femininity in your hands, like—" He shook his head. "Forget it. I'll call you a cab." "No." Norton felt an odd, sliding sensation in his chest. "I'll stay, Jeff. I'm sorry. It's been a long day." "You sure?" "Sure, I'm sure. Look, I don't want to judge you, Jeff. You're right. None of us are saints. We've all done things." Megan, astride him in the motel, feeds him her breasts with eyes focused somewhere else, as if he's some accustomed household task. Toward the end she closes her eyes altogether, thrusts herself up and down on his erection and into her climax, grunting, "You motherfucker, oh you fucking motherfucker," through gritted teeth. It will make him rock hard just thinking about it for weeks afterward, though he's close to certain it isn't him she's talking to, and when, in the aftermath, he asks her, she claims not to remember saying anything at all. Things we regret. Things we'd take back if we could. You think I'm any different? Jeff gave him a searching look. You're missing a pretty major point here, Tom. He raised his hands, palms open. There was something almost pleading in his face. I don't regret Nu Ying. Or the others. Because God knows Nu hasn't been the only one. I just never told you about the others after the way you reacted. Yeah, each time it's emotional complication, Tom. Stress I could do without. But I can't make myself feel bad about it, and I can't make myself wish it hadn't happened. Can you understand that? Can you stand knowing that about your brother? I can't make myself wish it hadn't happened. Norton put himself carefully back in the other armchair, gingerly on the edge of the seat. Jeff's words were like staples taken out of his heart, a sudden easing of a pain he hadn't fully known he was carrying. The bright truth about his feelings for Megan welled up in the new spaces. He sat there trying to balance it all out for a moment, then nodded. Sure, he said. I guess I can stand it. I guess I've got to. He shrugged, smiled faintly. Brothers, right? Jeff matched the nod vigorously. Right. So pour me another drink, big brother. Make up the spare room. What time's Megan getting back? Chapter 9. They slept in well-worn nano-weave survival bags, as used by real Mars settlers, the fraying label on Scott's insisted. But always inside. Too many eyes up there, Wren said somberly, as they stood at the hangar door on the evening of the second day and watched the stars begin to glimmer through in the east. It's better if we don't give them anything unusual to notice. The abandoned airfield buildings offered shelter from both satellite scan and desert sun. The heat built up inside during the day, but long ago shattered windows and doorways mostly without doors ensured a cooling through flow of air. The walls in the rooms they used were peeled of all but fragmentary patches of paint, stripped back to a pale beige plaster beneath, and none of the lights worked. The toilet facilities and showers, oddly enough, did seem to work, though again without the privacy of doors, and only cold water. There was no power for the elevator up to the control tower, but the stairs seemed safe enough, and once up there you had long views over the surrounding tangle of ancient concrete runways and the flat, open spaces beyond. Wren spent a lot of her time up there in the tower, watching, he supposed, for signs of unwelcome visitors, and talking in low tones with the stranger, with him. And that last part worried Scott, for reasons he could not entirely pin down. He supposed, finally, it was lack of faith. Pastor William had always said it attacked the so-called free-thinkers first and worst, and God knew Scott had been away long enough to get contaminated, rubbing up against all the smut and doubt of West Coast life. He felt a vague, uncontrolled spurt of anger at the thought of it. The bright LCLS nights, the non-stop corrosive, stimulus-ridden whirl of so-called modern living, and no escape anywhere, not even in church, because God knew he'd gone there and tried. All that lukewarm anything-cuddly-goes sermonizing, all the meeting-house hand-holding circles, and the flaky, moist-eyed psychobabble that never went anywhere except to justify whatever weakling failures of moral vision the speakers had allowed themselves to fall into. 3 fucking years and more of it, clogging the certainty of his own vision, confusing the simple algebra of good and evil. He damn fucking well knew he was right, because that was the way it damn fucking well felt. His head ached. Had been aching, on and off, since he'd woken in the back of the swaying truck and touched the field dressing wrapped just above his eyes. The doctor Wren took him to that night outside Fresno told him it was a normal symptom for the head injuries he'd sustained. With luck it should fade in a few days. Head injuries the stranger had given Scott. And how could that be right? At first he couldn't make sense of it. "He will return," Pastor William's soft tones, rolling out over the pulpit like thunder a long way off. Thunder you knew was riding in on the wings of a storm coming right your way. They said he'd trained at one of the South Carolina megachurches before he got his ministry, and in the teeth of the gale he blew you could well believe it. He will return, and how's that going to be, you ask yourselves? Well, I'll tell you, friends, I'll tell you, building now to a roar, it ain't going to be no cluster-hugging, happy-clapping day like them niggers always singing on about. No, sir, the day of his return ain't gonna be no party, ain't gonna be no picnic and skipping road right up to paradise for you all. When Jesus comes again, he will come in judgment, and that judgment going to be hard on man and woman and child, hard on us all because we are all sinners, and that sin, that dreadful black sin, got to be paid out once and for all. Look in your hearts, my friends, look in your hearts and find that black sin there, and pray you can cut it out of you before judgment, because if you don't, then the Lord will, and the Lord don't use no anesthetic when he operates on your soul. There was a story Scott remembered from the End Times Comics, Volume 3, Issue 137, The Triumph in Babylon. Colt-wrapped, the Savior stalks the mirror-glass canyons of New York, with a long navy colt on one hip, and a billy club in his hand fashioned from the sweat and blood-stained wood of the cross he died on. He kicks in the frosted glass door of a coffee franchise off Wall Street, and beats 7 shades of damnation out of the money changers gathered there. Painted, black-stockinged lady brokers twisting prostrate at his feet, red-licked lips parted in horror and abandonment, thighs exposed under short, whorish skirts. Fat, big-nosed men in suits, braying and panicking, trying to get away from the scything club, blood and waxed coffee cups flying, screams, the capitalized crunch of broken bones. Judgment. Scott touched the bandage around his head again, figured maybe he'd gotten off lightly after all. In the truck, staring at the gaunt, sleeping face, he'd leaned across and whispered to Wren, "Is it really him?" She'd given him a strange look. "Who'd you think it is?" "Him. Jesus. The Lord. Come again." He swallowed, wet his lips. "Is this... Are we living in the... the end times?" No response. She just looked at him curiously and told him to rest. He was going to need his strength. Thinking back, he guessed he must probably have sounded delirious with the concussion. And then the doctor, and other helpers along the way. People Wren seemed to know well. A change of trucks, a house, and a soft bed on the outskirts of a town whose name he never saw. Another long, bone-jarring night in an all-terrain vehicle and tipping out at dawn on the airfield's deserted expanse. And then the waiting. He tried to make himself useful. He tidied up after Wren and the stranger, put their bags and bedrolls straight every morning, and, oddly, glimpsed in among Wren's gear a Bible and a sheaf of curling hard copy from Republican ministry download sites, some of which he knew well himself. He closed the bag gently and didn't look again. He wasn't nosy by nature, but it made him frown all the same. He put it out of his mind as much as he could. Instead, he put together a table and 3 dining places out of pieces of junk he found lying around in the control tower block and the hangars. He discovered a wrecked and wingless Cessna in one hangar corner, half-heartedly draped in thick plastic sheeting that he cut up and made into hanging curtains for a couple of the toilet cubicles and the showers. He took care of the food. The supplies the all-terrain driver had left them were mostly pull-tab auto-heating, but he did his best to make meals out of what there was, carrying them up to the other 2 in the tower when they showed no sign of coming down to eat. Tried not to stare at the stranger. He took the painkillers the doctor had given him sparingly, and he prayed diligently every time he ate or slept. In an odd way, he felt better about life than he had in months. "Won't be much longer now." He started. When night fell, the quiet in the derelict building seemed to deepen somehow, and Wren's voice jumped him like a gunshot. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway that led through to the tower stairs. Light from the last red-gold leavings of the sunset outside meshed with the bluish glow of the camping lamps he'd lit, picking up a gleam in her eyes and along the teeth of the zip fastener on the ancient leather jacket she wore. "What you doing?" "Praying." Half defiant, because he certainly hadn't noticed her doing it in the last few days. She nodded, moved into the room and folded herself down onto her sleeping bag with unconscious grace. "We need to talk," she said, and he thought she sounded weary. "Why don't you come over here?" He nearly jumped again. "What for?" "I won't bite you, Scott. I know that. I can hear you from here, though." "Maybe you can. But I'd rather we didn't have to shout. Now come over here." Tight-lipped, he got up from his own bedroll and walked over to hers. She nodded to her left, and he squatted awkwardly beside her, not quite sitting down. Her scent washed over him, faintly unclean with desert sweat. He thought she hadn't showered since early the day before. She looked into his face, and he felt the same old flip in his chest. She nodded upward, toward the ceiling and the tower above. "You know who that is up there," she murmured, "don't you?" Exhilaration sloshed in his guts, chased up and met the feeling she'd made under his ribs. He managed a jerky nod of his own. "It is, isn't it?" "Yeah, it is," she sighed. "This is difficult for me, Scott. I grew up in a big family that had some Christians in it, but I wasn't one of them. My religious experience is very different from yours. Where I'm from, we accepted that other beliefs were possible, but we always thought they were just other ways of looking at the same truths we believed in. Less accurate, less enlightened paths. I never thought that maybe our truth would be the less enlightened one, that the Christians would be the ones who got it right, that—" She shook her head. "I never considered that." He felt a warm, protective affection for her surge up inside, like flames. He reached out and took her hand where it lay in her lap, squeezed gently. "It's okay," he said. "You were true to your beliefs. That's what counts. I mean, you have to believe what you see with your own eyes, Scott, right?" Her eyes held his. "You have to believe what you're told when nothing else makes any sense, right?" He drew a deep breath. "This makes perfect sense to me, Carmen." "Yeah, well, here's the thing, and I don't know if there's anything in your Bible that covers this, because it certainly isn't what I was taught about the final cycle. He says," another upward tilt of her eyes, "that he's come early, that it's not time yet, and he has to gather his strength. He has work to do here, but his enemies are out there and they're still strong, and that means we have to protect him until it is time. He's chosen us, Scott. Sorted us from the chaff? Yeah, the chaff. You saw what he did with Nocera and Ward? They were servants of the darkness, Scott. I see that now. I mean, I never liked Nocera and Ward. Well, I thought he was okay, but—" "Satan has 1,000 snares," Scott told her. 1,000 masks to wear." "Right." He hesitated, looking at her. "Are you his—" He tasted the word, awkward on his tongue. "His handmaiden?" "Yes, that's what he's told me. Until one of the angels can come to take on the task. Until then, he says he'll speak through me." He was still holding her hand. He let go, pulled his own hands back as if she were hot to the touch. He tried not to stare at how beautiful she was. "You are so worthy of it," he said hoarsely. "You'll be filled with light." Then her hand was on him, on the buckle of his belt, pulling him to her. She leaned in and brushed her parted lips across his mouth, pulled back again. He gaped. Blood hammered in his head. Below the belt buckle he felt suddenly trapped and swollen. "What are you doing?" he hissed. She gestured at the ceiling. "He's up there, Scott. Staying up there, keeping watch for us. It's all right." "No, it's—" shaking his head numbly, trying to explain. It's a sin, Carmen." He wanted to move away from her, but in moving he only tipped back over in his awkward crouch and wound up sitting slumped against the wall behind him, still on the bedroll. He hadn't succeeded in opening the distance between them at all. Or maybe, he'd wondered about it afterward, maybe he just hadn't wanted to move away from her after all. "Carmen," he pleaded, "we can't be sinners. Not now, not here. It's wrong." But Carmen Wren only hooked a thumb inside the neckline of her shirt, looked down at her own hand, and tugged. The static seam split with a tiny crackle, and she ran her thumb downward, opening the shirt on the moulded lift of her breasts in their profiler cups. He could see through the clear plastic sheen to where her nipples were pressed flat against the inner surface of each cup. She looked up again and smiled at him. "How can it be?" she asked simply. "Scott, don't you see? Don't you feel it? This is meant to be. This is a sacrament, a purification for both of us, a gift of his love. Reach inside yourself. Don't you feel it?" And he did. It had been a very long time. He was not a virgin, not since the 11th grade and Janie Wilkins, and Janie hadn't exactly been the only one before he left for the Rim either, though he tried not to take pride in that because he knew pride in it was wrong. But the girls had always come to him. No way to deny it. Scott took after his mother, was tall and long-legged, and he'd hardened his upper body in his early teens, putting in all the part-time hours he could get, stringing fences and river security for the big Bitterroot land parcels, so later he'd be able to pay his own way through 10th to 12th grade and not be a burden, or have to sign up for a youth stint with the Marines if he wanted to finish out his education. And then, for all his muscle and length of limb, he was still soft-spoken and kind. And it seemed from what Janie told him that didn't hurt too much either when a girl was looking. But in the Rim, something happened to him. Maybe it was the fact that sex was suddenly everywhere, perfectly toned and tampered with bodies, impossible to know if they were real flesh or generated V-format interfaces, but there they were, twining around each other on the big LCLS billboards, on storefront display screens, on those high-end pixelated shopping bags the women carried in fistfuls like a harvest of some big, brightly coloured oblong fruit held up by the stalks and vines. There was flesh and liquid moaning on every non-faith channel he had viewing access to, in every ad-tagged piece of mail he opened, on the trash cans for God's sake, and even once, when he was down in the Freeport, sketched holographically across the sky and booming out of massive speakers along Venice Beach. Maybe it was that, the unending barrage, the overload of it all, or maybe it was just that he was heartsick for what he'd left behind. Whatever it was, by the end of the first year, the gentle confidence he'd enjoyed back home had gone wisping off him like steam off a morning coffee left out on the porch, had left him lonely and cold. Carmen Wren burned through his loneliness like a falling star. Months of half-denied fantasy boiled up inside him. Her flesh, where he touched it, where she guided his hands, was warm and smooth, and her tongue in his mouth tasted of some dark, unfamiliar spice. She peeled one of the profiler cups for him, dropped the jellied weight of the breast beneath into his hand. It seemed to fit there as if made for him to hold, as if intended that way. Her hands went back to his belt, loosened it and slipped inside. He went rigid as she slid fingers around the shaft of his erection, squeezing hard at her breast in reflex. She moaned into his mouth. They worked each other out of the clothes piecemeal, stopping to kiss and touch until finally she lay back on the bedroll naked, brushed her own hands down her flanks and opened her thighs for him. He shifted on elbows and hands, a little awkward with lack of custom, and then gasped as he slipped into her. The evening air was cool and breezy against his skin, and Carmen Wren was heated and wet inside. She smiled, shifted sideways lazily, did something with her internal muscles. He felt himself gripped along the length of his cock, a slippery, tugging intimacy, and then she pulled him down on top of her, lifted her thighs and clamped them to his sides. They burned like branding in the cool, And he came, sudden and rushing, unstoppable, jolting like there was current through him off some badly insulated cable. He hung his head, stayed propped on his elbows. "I'm sorry." She smiled up at him again, wiggled a little and tensed her muscles around his fading hardness. "Don't be. You know how it makes me feel, seeing you lose control like that? It's just—" he could feel himself flushing. "Been a long time, you know." "Yeah, I guessed that. It doesn't matter, Scott. We've got time. I like you inside me. We'll go again when you're ready." Another twitch of that coiled muscle, and a sudden widening of her eyes. "Oh, in fact—" He didn't know if it was the way she talked, casual as she lay there under him, as if they were sitting in a breakfast diner together, or maybe just the fact that he had her here, the culmination of so many damp, hopeless daydreams when he went home from Ward Biosupply alone. Or maybe it was that word, handmaiden, drumming around in his head, still on his lips like the dark, spiced taste of her. He didn't know. Truth be told, didn't much care. He knew, because Janey had once told him, that he was uncommonly fast back in the saddle, but even for him this was something else. He felt himself hardening right there inside her, swelling against that thing she did with those muscles, and he knew this time it was going to be all right. It was going to be a long, sweet ride. Afterward they lay in a tangle of limbs on the bedroll, backs to the peeling wall, partially draped with a sleeping bag and Wren's jacket, gazing at the slice of evening sky just visible through the empty doorway that led outside. They seemed like sentinels, vibrating gently in the soft, blue-black wishing well. He told her that, and she chuckled deep in her chest. "Postcoital astronomy," she said. "No," he said, letting her have her joke, but firm despite it. "This is special, Carmen. We're blessed tonight." She made a small, non-committal noise and stretched a little. "You know," she told him a little later, "it could be for a long time, this hiding. It's going to be tough. I don't mind." "Yeah." She rubbed a hand on the stubble of his cheek, mock roughly. "I imagine you're used to tough, aren't you? Will Rimsek come after us?" "I don't know." Her tone was thoughtful. "There are people I've called to tidy up back at the dock. They'll cover our traces. That'll be a start. We have friends, Scott. More friends than you'd imagine." "And enemies," he said. "Yeah, enemies too." He twisted his head to look into her face. "Tell me the truth, Carmen. Is this the end times? When the world goes down in flames and the beast rises from the ocean with the names of blasphemy written upon him, is that who we're up against? The beast?" She hesitated. "I don't think so. He hasn't talked about that. But I do know this much. Somewhere out there's a dark man looking for him and for us. This man is a servant of the darkness, and that's who we have to guard against, Scott. Both of us. Whatever happens, we're servants of the light, and we have to keep watch. The black man is coming. And when he comes, we have to be ready to fight, if necessary to the death. Are you ready for that?" "Of course I am. I'll do anything, but—" She shifted, pushing herself up against the wall so she could look him in the eye. "But what?" Scott looked up at the ceiling. "Can't he do anything about this black man?" "Not yet," she said gently. "At least that's what he tells me. It isn't time. He has other concerns, Scott, other work to do. It's complicated, I know. I don't pretend to understand it all myself, but I know what's been revealed to me, and all I can do is tell you the same. We have to have faith, Scott. That's what he told me. That's a Christian strength, isn't it? Having faith, not questioning what's revealed?" Yeah. And yes, maybe this doesn't make a lot of sense right now, but if we have faith, I think it will. We have a part to play in this, Scott. You have a part. There's a reckoning in the wind and a harrowing to come. Those who stand in its way will fall. Those who follow in faith will be raised up. Then that means—" He squeezed her hand tightly. Blood thudded in him. He felt his groin stir faintly. He has come in judgment. It is the time. And then, abruptly, he remembered the gaunt, hollow-eyed stare of the stranger, remembered how it felt to be fixed by those eyes at close range, and looking up at the ceiling again, he no longer felt the warm pulse of longed-for vindication, the affirmation of all he'd struggled to believe and hold true. Instead, out of nowhere, he remembered those eyes, that stripped-to-the-bone face, and all he felt was cold and afraid. A reckoning in the wind. Chapter 10. 50 kilometers outside Van Horn, Interstate Highway 10 laid down a luminescent pale strip of grey in the desert night, stretching away toward low, horizon-hugging mountain ranges whose names the man calling himself Eddie Tanaka had never bothered to learn. Stars punctured the velvet blue-black above like knife points, sharp white contrast to the dull, red, glowing orbs of the auto-haul rigs below, as they hammered along through the darkness in both directions, following the highway with insectile machine focus. Rising drone, blast past rush of dark noise and wind, drone collapsing back into the distance. Passing the garish LCLS lights of Tabitha's with a detachment no human driver could have mustered. Well, maybe a glitch, he allowed sourly. They don't got much use for this kind of merchandise. He glanced up at the brothel's skyline billboard. The name in vampiric, spidery red lettering the original Tabitha would never have agreed to if she hadn't sold up and moved to the rim as soon as she had the capital. Behind the spiky thin lettering, as if caged in by it, female figures switched back and forth in full, flesh-toned colour. Pixeled almost, but legal requirements and all not quite, up to human footage perfect. Gleech wouldn't be out here on the highway anyway. They don't drive. That you know of. That Kennan knew of, and he fucking was one smart guy. Smart guy? Yeah, you're some fucking smart guy, Max, out in the parking lot of Tabitha's with horse snot on your jacket and not even a blowjob to show for it. All your plans and schemes, your carve-out-a-new-life bullshit, look where you're standing still. Snot on your clothes and no blowjob. That's how fucking smart you are, smart guy. Smart guy. He heard his own mutter, final echo off the abrupt, tinny dispute he'd just mounted in his head. Knew he was sub-vocalizing again, knew why. Knew, too, why he hadn't bothered, couldn't be bothered, to push Chrissy into blowing him. Never can fucking leave it at just one shot, can you? He'd dumped the Sinner Drive into his eyes a couple of hours earlier, and the thing was this was quality product, right out of his own stash, not the stepped-on shit he shifted to the kids in Van Horn and Kent on a Saturday night. So he fucking well knew he'd only need that single squirt. And initially that was what he settled for, just the one drop a load, dribbled down onto the quivering surface of his left eye, what the kids called pirate dosage. But pirate shots always, fucking always, left him feeling weirdly unbalanced. And that was on a good night, which tonight wasn't. And so as the Sinner Drive came on, that feeling of fucked-up symmetry built and fucking built until it seemed like the whole right side of his body was just too slow and sleepy to bear, and so he gave in and tipped his head back one more time before he hit the road, and the fluid rolled down his right eyeball like tears. Was a time, he recalled, you had the discipline. Discipline, or self-respect, either way something that wouldn't let you do this to yourself. He was remembering that time a lot these days, staring into mirrors at rooms he abruptly couldn't believe he belonged in, wondering how he'd wound up here and where it had all leaked away to. That time when sin was a tool like any other, useful and used with a wired confidence that would have been arrogance if it hadn't all felt so fucking clean and right. Back before it all turned to shit in a black pall of smoke across a Wyoming sundown sky. Was a time. Sure. And there was another fucking time the summers never seemed to end and you'd never paid for it in your life. Remember that? Time passes, Max. Get over it. Skip the fucking nostalgia. Let's get where we're at. And here he was. Snot and no blowjob out in the night. He wiped a hand down his jacket, not bothering to look. The Cinedrive hooked in visual memory and sparked a link to neuromotor precision, put the gesture right on target, and his fingers came away gummy with the snot. He rubbed them back and forth, grimacing. He didn't need this shit right now. Not the way things were. Not like he didn't have enough stress. He told her. He fucking told her he had other stuff cooking, stuff that needed managing, not like this pimping shit was his main gig. Yeah, right, the Sin told him crisply. How many years we been saying that exactly, smart guy? Different this time. This pays off like it has been. This time next year we're out for good. And if it doesn't? If it doesn't, we're already set up to cover. Quit worrying. Set up to cover, yeah. And go on being a pimp for life. What you going to do about Chrissy then? What he was going to do then, he reflected somberly, was going to have to do about Chrissy then, was probably something violent. Should have seen that one all along. Fucking bitch always had been high maintenance. Even back in Houston when she was still working street corners. Cotton candy mane of blonde and that manicured fucking Texan drawl, and now the sub-cute tit work he'd gotten for her. He should have fucking known she'd start with the airs and graces as soon as she settled in at Tabitha's. Acting just like she actually was the Bonobo purebred they'd packaged her as. Calling him at all hours, or pushing Tabitha's management so they called instead, bitching about how she wouldn't work on account of some headache or stomach cramp, or just plain didn't like some fat fuck who'd paid good money to get between her legs, sitting there on the fucking bed bright-eyed and whining, Eddie this, Eddie that, Eddie the fucking other, forcing him to wheel out the whole 9 yards of bully, threaten, cajole like it was some favourite comic routine she liked to see him do. So why the fuck didn't you just take Serena or Maggie for that sub-cute work instead? Either one would be half the fucking trouble. In the hyperlucid blast of the Sin, he knew why. But he turned on his heel and put the knowledge at his back, along with the blink-blink carnal come-on of Tabitha's skyline billboard. The relative gloom of the softly lit parking lot darkened his vision. He blinked hard to adjust. "Hello, Max." The voice jolted him as he blinked, kicked him back to the scorpion memories, to times and places so vivid he opened his eyes and almost expected to find himself back there, back before Wyoming in that other, cleaner time. But he wasn't. He was still here, in the deserted parking lot of a second-rate Texas bordello, with a sassy whore's snot drying on his fingers and too much sin for his own good sparking through his brain. The figure detached itself from the shadows around his car, stood to face him. Soft, violet light from the lot's marker lamps threw the form into silhouette, killed facial recognition. But something about the stance chased up the memories the voice had stirred. The Sin gave him a name, features to put on the darkened form. He stared, trying to make sense of it. "You?" The figure shifted, made a low gesture with one hand. "But," he shook his head, You're on fucking Mars, man." The figure said nothing, waited. Eddie moved closer, arms raised toward a tentative, hugging embrace. "When did you get back? I mean, man, what are you doing back here?" "Don't you know?" He made a baffled smile, genuine in its origins. "No, man, I've got no fucking—" And the smile collapsed, bleached out with sudden understanding. For just an instant, the desert quiet and the rushing away of an auto hauler on the highway. He clawed across his belly, under his jacket, had fingers hooked around the butt of the compact Colt Citizen he kept cling-padded at his belt. He'd moved too close. The knowledge dripped through him, and it was a scorpion knowing from that other time, somehow sad and slow, despite the speed at which he could see it all coming apart. The figure snapped forward, bruising grip on his wrist, and pinned his gun arm where it was. He flung up a warding left arm, chopped at the other man's throat, or face, or too close, too fucking close in, and here came the block. He had nothing, could do nothing. A low kick took out his legs from under him, a full-body shove, and he went down. He rolled desperately. "Don't let the fucker get on you with his boots. Land on your back, maybe. The gun. The fucking gun!" The cling clip held. He got a grip of the Colt's butt again, dragged it loose, and sprawled backward with a snarl of relief, raising the pistol. The Citizen had no safety, just squeeze hard, and... The figure stood over him, black against the sky, arm down, pointing. and something flattened him to the ground again, something with godlike force. Muffled crack. His ears took it in, but it took him a couple of moments to assign it any importance. The stars were right overhead. He watched them, abruptly fascinated. They seemed a lot closer than you'd expect, hanging low, like they'd taken a sudden interest. He wheezed, felt something leaking rapidly like cold water in his chest. He knew what it was. The sin forced a merciless clarity. He lifted his head, and it was the hardest work he'd ever done, as if his skull were made of solid stone. He made out the figure of the other man, arm still pointing down at him like some kind of judgment. "I figured you'd fight," said the voice. "But it's been a long time for you, hasn't it? Too long. Maybe that's why." "Why what?" he wondered, muzzily. He coughed, tasted blood in his throat, wondered also what Chrissy was going to do now. Stupid little bitch. "I think you're done," said the voice. He tried to nod, but his head just fell back on the gritty surface of the lot, and this time it stayed there. The stars, he noticed, seemed to be dimming, and the sky looked colder than it had before, less velvet soft, and more like the open void it really was. Dead in a brothel parking lot, for fuck's sake. He heard the blast past of another auto-hauler out on the highway, saw in his mind's eye the cosy red glow of its tail lights accelerating away into the darkness. He ran to catch up. Part 2. Off the Hook. Curtailment of freedom is a powerful social tool and must be deployed as such, with wisdom and restraint. It is therefore vital to distinguish between the genuine and quite complex parameters of what is socially necessary and the simplistic and emotive demands of a growing popular hysteria. Failure to make this distinction is likely to have unattractive consequences. Jacobson Report, August 2091. Chapter 11. In the end, it went down in the chapel, pretty much as he'd expected it would. Prisons like this didn't offer many places free of surveillance, but Florida's faith-based approach to rehabilitation meant that a man had a charter-enshrined right to privacy and prayer at any hour outside of the night lockdown. No securicams, no invasive scrutiny. The theory was, presumably, that in the house of the Lord the corrections officers didn't need to be watching you because God already was. No one seemed to notice that the Lord was falling down on the job. In the 3 months since Carl transferred from Miami, there'd been at least half a dozen bloody showdowns in the low-light arena of the chapel. 2 ended in fatal injury. Carl wasn't sure if at some level prison staff were giving sanction to the fights, or if quiet and massive pressure from above kept the matter clean of investigation or review. In the end it came to the same thing. No one wanted to buck the system. No one wanted to hear about it. Sigma Corporation, by invoking religious status for its operation, effectively sidestepped the bulk of what weak administrative oversight the Confederated Republic was prepared to endorse, and glowing testimonials at the congressional level pissed all over the rest. The bodies were taken away, shrink-wrapped in black. "See, nigger, you gotta put your trust in the Lord," grinned the Guatemalan when he sold him the shank. He nodded at the little oil lamp altar he had on a corner shelf, though it was the black-skinned Virgen of Guadalupe behind the flickering flame. "Like the governor always saying at the assemblies, the Lord got your back, but it don't never hurt to equalize, right?" The shank itself was a splinter of home-grown practicality that echoed the pragmatism in the Guatemalan's words. Someone had taken the monofil blade off a workshop fret saw and piece-melted an array of coloured plastic beads around the lower half to form a garish, pebbly-surfaced grip. The whole thing was less than 20 centimetres long, and the beads had been carefully selected for a surface that resisted fingerprinting. That left genetic trace, of course, but the Guatemalan was thorough, and he'd carefully anointed his customers' hands from a tiny bottle he kept on the same shelf as the Virgen. Brief, high-tech reek of engineered molecules cutting through the fart and patchouli warmth in the cell as Carl rubbed the fluid in, then the volatile bulk evaporated and left a fading chill on his palms. For a good 3 or 4 hours now, any skin cells he shed from either hand would be useless to a gene sniffer. The high and low-tech mix sent a faint shudder of recollection through him. Going equipped among the nighttime shanties of Caracas, the city centre spread out below him like a bowl of stars, the close warmth of barely lit streets up where he prowled, the confidence of well-chosen weaponry and what it would do. Eventually, of course, the monofil would cut into the plastic enough to loosen the mounting, and with time the blade would drop out. But by then the whole weapon would have been dropped through the grate on some basement ventilation duct. Like a lot of what went on inside the South Florida State Partnership Sigma Holdings correctional facility, it was strictly a short-term option. It was also expensive. 17, the Guatemalan wanted. He liked Carl enough to add explanations. My boy Danny gotta run big risks down in the shop, putting something like this together. Then I gotta hold it for you. Do your hands for you. Find the downtime for handover. Full service like that don't come cheap. Carl looked back into the man's polished coal features, shrugged, nodded. There was a degree of race solidarity operating in South Florida State, but it didn't do to push it too far. And he had the 17. Had, in fact, nearly 24 of the 20 mil endorphin capsules that served the prison as a high-denomination contraband currency. Never mind that he'd need them in a couple of weeks to trade against whatever debased form of Grigo Louis the Chem could swing for him this time around. Never mind that he might need endorphins for his own wounds a few hours hence. Short-term focus. Now he needed the shank. Worry about the rest later if and when he had the leisure. Short-term focus. It was a profoundly depressing feature of life in the prison that increasingly he caught himself thinking like his fellow inmates. Adaptive behaviour, Sutherland would have tagged it. Like finding himself masturbating to cheap porn, something he'd also done his share of since Florida's penal system had swept him up into its clammy embrace. Best, he'd found, to simply not think about it at all. So he stepped out of the Guatemalan's cell and went casually back down the B-wing thoroughfare, right arm held slightly bent. Under his sleeve, the chill of the monofil strip warmed slowly against his skin. Grey nanocarb scaffolding rose on either side of him, holding up 3 levels of galleries and the tracks for the big surveillance cams. The wing was roofed in arched transparency, and late afternoon light sifted down into the quiet of the hall. Most of general population were out on partnership work projects, paying their debt to society in Sigma's corporate coffers. The few who remained in B-wing leaned off the galleries in ones or twos, or stood in small knots across the hall floor. Conversation evaporated as he passed, eyes swivelling to watch him. On the lower right-hand gallery, a grizzled long-timer called Andrews stared down at him and nodded in fractional acknowledgement. Suddenly, despite the sunlight, Carl felt cold. It wasn't the coming fight. Equipped as he now was, Carl was reasonably sure he could take Dudek without too much trouble. The Aryans either weren't hooked up outside the prison or just hadn't done their research. All they knew about Carl Marsalis was that he talked funny for a nigger, was up from Miami on some foreign national retention loophole, and, at 41, was old. Possibly they thought he was some kind of terrorist, therefore foreign, and a coward who had everything coming to him. Certainly they believed that lean-muscled, tats-covered 20-something Jack Dudek was going to rip his shit apart, whoever he fucking was. That nigger had to learn some respect. It wasn't the fight. It was the creeping sense of the trap that came with it. 3 months in this corporate, new-built shithole. Before that, 5 weeks in the Miami high-risk unit. No trial, no bail. Release assessment dates set back time and again. Access to lawyers refused. Appeals and diplomatic pressure from Ungla summarily thrown out, no end in sight. He could feel the time getting away from him like blood loss. There was an ongoing investigation that no one was prepared to talk about, but Carl knew it had to do with Caracas and the death of Richard Wilbrink. It had to be. Relations between the UN and the Republic had never been great, but there was no way the Florida state legislature would have held out against major diplomacy for the sake of a single low-grade vice bust that already screamed entrapment. No. Somewhere in the processing, when the fetal murder team took him down, his documentation had tripped a high-level wire. Connections had been made, whether in Langley or Washington or some covert operations base farther south, and the national security beast was awake. Ghost agencies were looking for payback, cold, covert vengeance for one of their own. They were going to make an example of Karl Marsalis, and while they tried to assemble the necessary legal toys to do it, he was going to stay safely locked down in a Republic prison. And if he shanked Jack Dudek today as he fully intended to, they might not be able to pin it on him, but it was still going to put him back into close management and provide the perfect pretext for another lengthy extension of holding time, maybe even a subsidiary sentence. More than a few times in the last month he'd woken with a panicky shortness of breath and a dreamlike certainty that he would never get out of this place. It was starting to look like premonition. He locked down the fear, siphoned it carefully into anger, and stoked it up. He stopped at the B-wing gate and raised his face for the laser. The blue light licked over his features, the machine consulted its real-time records, and the gate cracked open. He paced through. The chapel was left and halfway down a 50-metre corridor that led to kitchen storage. Surveillance would have him for 25 metres along the passage, would see him turn in through the impressively sculpted genetique double doors, and that was all they would know. Karl felt the mesh shudder online, jerky and grating with Louis' substandard Grego chlorides. "All right, Jackie boy. Let's fucking do this." The chapel doors gave smoothly as he pushed them, oozed backward on hydraulic hinges, and showed him twin rows of pews, also in genetique. The furniture sat like islands on the shine of the fused glass floor. The interior architecture soared modestly in echo of a modern church. Angled spots made the altar rail and lectern gleam. In the space between the rail and the first row of pews, Jack Dudek stood with another, bulkier Aryan at his side. Both wore their corporate prison blue coveralls peeled neatly to the waist and tied off. Sleeveless, generic grey T-shirts showed beneath. A third, shaven-headed weight bench type, similarly dressed, hauled himself up from his slumped position between two pews halfway down on the right. He was chewing gum. "Hello, nigger," said Dudek loudly. Marsalis nodded. "Needed help, did you?" "Don't need me no fucking help to carve a slice off your ass, boy. Marty and Roy here just wanted to make sure we ain't disturbed." "That's right, nigger." The gum chewer squeezed out between the pew ends, eyes screwed up in a grin, voice leaning hard on the insult. Karl tamped down a flaring rage and thought about hooking out those eyes with his thumbnails. "Lock it down, Soak." It was depressing, the same time-slip sense of loss at his reactions. Over the last 4 months he could track his own change in attitude toward the antique racial epithets still in wide use across the Republic. Nigger. The first couple of times it was disconcerting and almost quaint, like having your face slapped with a dueling glove. With time it came to feel more and more like the verbal spittle it was intended to be. That his fellow blacks in general population used it of themselves did nothing to stem the slowly awakening anger. It was a locally evolved defense, and he was not from there. Fuck these Republicans and their chimpanzee-level society. "Lock it down." The gum chewer came ponderously up the aisle toward him. Karl moved to the right-hand bank of pews and waited, nailed the approaching Aryan's gaze as he came level, watched the man's eyes for the move if it was coming. He figured boot to shin and elbow uppercut to chin if he had to, left side strikes. He didn't want to show Dudek the shank ahead of time. But the other man was as good as Dudek's word. He brushed past with a snort of contempt and stationed himself at the door. Karl moved down the aisle, feeling the mesh now like arousal, like the juddering of bad brakes. It wasn't ideal, but the tidal power of it would do. He stepped out from between the two last pews and faced Dudek across 5 meters of fused glass. He lifted his left hand in a casual gesture, designed to lead the Aryan's attention away from his right. Rejoiced silently as Dudek's eyes flickered to follow the move. "So bird shit. You want to run me your rap now?" Karl burlesqued a Jesus Land comedy drawl. The South will rise again. South already risen, nigger, blurted the big Aryan next to Dudek. Confederated Republic is the white man's America. Carl let his gaze shift briefly to the speaker. Yeah, that seems to have worked out well for you. The big Aryan bristled, surged forward. Dudek lifted a hand and pressed him back without looking away from Carl. No call to get all riled up, Lee, he said softly. This here... Jack. It was a hissed prison whisper from the door. The lookout gesturing furiously. Jack! CO's coming! The change was unreal, almost comical. In seconds flat, the two Aryans in front of Carl hit the front pew side by side, shaven heads bent in an attitude of prayer. Back by the door, the lookout moved 2 rows down and did the same. Carl stifled a snort and found a front seat of his own on the far side of the aisle from Dudek and Roy. The mesh surged and pounded for release. He kept peripheral awareness of the 2 men and waited, head down, controlling his breathing. If the correctional officers passed by without stopping, the fight was going to kick off again right where it got paused. Only by then Roy would have calmed down and the chances of goading him back up to interference levels would be lost. Carl had planned to fuck with the big Aryan's head just enough to get him in Dudek's way, and then use the confusion to shank them both. Now... Footfalls at the back of the chapel. Marsalis? Fuck. He looked around. 3 COs, 2 from the B-Wing day crew, Fultz and Garcia, both hefting stun-wrapped carbines and scanning the pews with seasoned calm. The other guy was a stranger, unarmed, and the phone clip he wore at ear and jaw looked shiny new with lack of use. White male, 40s or older. Carl made him for admin side and probably senior. There was grey in his hair, and the face was lined with middle-aged working weariness, but his eyes lacked the laconic watchfulness of the men who walked the galleries. The fact that Carl didn't know him wasn't in itself of note. South Florida State was a big prison, but the appeal and counter game had taken him across to admin close to 12 times now, and he was good with faces. Wherever this guy worked wasn't somewhere Carl had been or seen. "'What you doing here, Marsalis?" Fultz's jaws worked a steady, tight jaw rhythm on the gum in his mouth. "You ain't no believer." It didn't require an answer. Garcia and Fultz were old hands. They knew what went down in the chapel. Fultz's eyes tracked across to Dudek and Lee. He nodded to himself. "Finding racial harmony in the Lord, are we, boys?" Neither of the front pew Aryans said anything, and back at the door the 3rd supremacist had the butt of Garcia's carbine almost at his ear. "That's enough," snapped the new face. "Marsalis, you're required in admin." A tiny surge of hope. Meetings with Andritsky, the Ungla rep, were alternate Tuesdays, late morning. For someone to turn up this late in the week unannounced, it had to be progress. Had to be. Someone, somewhere, had found the key log in the Republican logjam of xenophobia and moral illusion. Pressure applied, it would break up the jam and set the whole legal and diplomatic process flowing downstream once more. The trigger line of code that would crack Carl Marsalis out of this fucking prison glitch and send him home. "Yeah, you'd better hope, Soak." He let the shank slide out of his sleeve and land gently on the pew beside him. He tucked it back against the upright with his fingers and got up, leaving it there, invisible to anyone, including the Aryans who didn't have a clear angle of vision on where he'd been sitting. 17, he remembered, and felt a faint chill at the thought. He didn't have the finances or the juice to buy again if this didn't work out, and they sent him back to B-Wing to face Dudek and the supremacist grudge. And mesh or no mesh, without an edged weapon he was probably going to get hurt. Suddenly the hope in his belly collapsed into sick despair and a pointless, billowing anger. "Reggie Barnes, I hope you fucking die on that respirator." He walked up the aisle toward the COs. Dudek turned to watch him go. Carl caught it in peripheral vision, swung his head to meet the Aryan's gaze. He saw the hunger there, the deferred bloodlust, and summoned a stone-faced detachment to meet it. But beneath the mask he found he was suddenly falling down weary of the youth and fury in the other man, of the hatred that seemed to seep not just out of Dudek and his kind, but right out of the prison walls around him, as if institutions like South Florida State were just glands in the Republican body politic, oozing the hate like some kind of natural secretion, stockpiling it and then pumping it back out into the circulatory system of the nation, corrosive and ripe for any focus it could find. "Eyes front, Dudek!" Fultz had spotted the sparks. His voice came out rich with irony. "That ain't how you pray, son." Carl didn't look back to watch Dudek comply. He didn't need to. Whichever way Dudek was now looking, it didn't matter. Carl could feel the Aryan's hatred at his back, pushing outward behind him like a vast, soft balloon, swelling to fill the space in the house of worship. Faith-based prison charter. Each man to his own personal god. And Dudek's was white as Polypuff packing chips. Sutherland's voice, deep and amused, like honey ladling down in the back of his head. "Nothing new in the hate, Soak. They need it like they need to breathe. Without it they fall apart. 13's just the latest hook to hang it off. That's supposed to make me feel better?" And Sutherland had shrugged. "Supposed to prepare you is all. What else were you looking for?" The hope and despair played seesaw in his guts all the way out of B-Wing and across the exercise yard to the administration building. Florida heat clutched at him like warm, damp towels. The glare off the nailed-down cloud cover hurt his eyes. He squinted and craned his neck in search of omens. There was no helicopter on the roof of the building, which meant no high-ranking visitors in from Tallahassee or Washington today. Nothing in the grey-roofed sky either, and no sound or sense of anything going on in the parking lot on the other side of the heavy-duty double fence. No journalistic flurry of activity, no uplink vans. A couple of months back, not long after he was transferred up to Florida State, Andritsky had leaked details to the press in an attempt to generate enough public embarrassment for a quick release. The tactic had backfired, with the Republic's media picking up almost exclusively on Carl's Ungler-covered ops status and the death of Gabriella at the Garrett Hawken camp. UN connections, fruitful leverage in any other corner of the globe, here only played directly into a long-standing paranoia that Washington had carefully nurtured since secession and before. And it didn't help that Carl was the colour of the Republic's deepest atavistic fears, served up through the id-feeding Technicolor TV drip that passed for national news coverage. He was just new dosage in a regime already 150 years screen-ingrained. Black male, detained, dangerous. For now, that seemed to be more than enough for Republican purposes. Neither Sigma nor the Florida State Legislature has seen fit to leak details of Carl's genetic status so far, for which he was duly grateful. In prison population here, it would have been tantamount to a death sentence. There'd be a line out the fucking cell block for him. Young men like Dudek, but of every race and creed, all filled with generalized hate and queuing up to test themselves against the monster. He wasn't sure why they were holding back. They must have the data by now. It was no secret what he was. A little digging at Garrett Hawken camp, or into the Ungler General Record, or even a trawl back 8 years to the Felipe Sousa coverage would have turned it up. He had assumed the Jesus-land media had backed off and muzzled themselves in time-honoured compliance with governmental authority, but he still couldn't work out why. Possibly they were holding back the knowledge as a weapon of last resort against the UN, or were afraid of the widespread panic it might trigger if it hit the public domain. Or maybe some worm-slow process of interagency protocol was still working itself out, and as soon as it cleared they'd have their vengeance for Wilbrink via that long line of shank-equipped angry young men. If he was still here by then. Hope, despair, the wrecking ball pendulum swing in his belly. They went in through the steel-barred complications of admin building security, where Carl was prodded about, machine-swiped, and patted down by hand. Harsh, directing voices, rough, efficient hands. Fultz bowed out, leaving Garcia and the stranger to lead their charge up 2 flights of clanging steel stairs, through a heavy door, and into the abrupt, thickly carpeted quiet of the prison's offices. Sudden cool, sweat drying on his skin. Textured walls, discrete corporate logos, Sigma and SFSP in muted tones, the deep blue and bright orange that characterized the inmate uniform bleached out here to pastel shades. the soft, occasional chime from a desk as data interfaces signaled a task complete. Carl felt his senses prickle with the change. A woman moved past him in a skirt. An actual woman. Not a hollow-porn confection. Early 50s, maybe, but fleshily handsome and moving for real under the clothing. He could smell her as she passed. Scent of woman and some heavy musk fragrance he knew vaguely. Life outside prison came suddenly and touched him at the base of his spine. "This way," the CO he didn't know gestured. "Conference 4. His heart dropped sickeningly into his guts. It was Andritsky. Conference 4 was a tiny, one-window chamber, no room for more than 2 or 3 people around the small oblong table, certainly no room for the assembled worthies of the state legislature or UN delegation. Nothing of consequence was going to go down in Conference 4. He'd have an hour with Andritsky, maybe some updates on the appeal, and then he was going back into general population and watching his back for Dudek. He was fucked. "Lock it down," he breathed, drew in the new knowledge and started to map it. Sutherland's situational zen. Don't bitch, don't moan, only see what it is and then ready yourself. Here came the door. Here came Andritsky and his attempts at camaraderie and comfort, none of it ever quite masking the obvious personal relief at not being where Carl was. Here came an hour of useless, bureaucratic narrative, punctuated with awkward silences and bitten-back rage at Ungler's total fucking impotence in this Jesus-land shithole. Here came... It wasn't Andritsky. Carl stopped dead in the open doorway. Sutherland's situational zen spiraled away from him like a sheaf of papers spilled down a well, like gulls riding the wind. The anger went with it, bleeding out. "Good afternoon, Mr. Marsalis." The speaker was a white male, tall and smoothly elegant in a grey-blue micropore suit that hung like Shanghai custom as he got up and came around the table, hand extended. "I'm Tom Norton from New York. Thank you, gentlemen, that'll be all for now. I'll buzz you when we're ready to leave." There was an electric silence. Carl could feel the exchange of glances going on behind his back. Garcia cleared his throat. "This is a violent crime inmate, sir. It's not acceptable procedure to leave you alone with him." "Well, that's curious." Norton's tone was urbane, but abruptly there was an edge in it. "From my records, it seems Mr. Marsalis is being held on a putative Dade County vice charge, and hasn't even been formally arraigned yet." "It's against procedure," insisted Garcia. "Sit down, please, Mr. Marsalis." Norton was looking past him at Garcia and the other CO. His expression had turned cold. He took a phone from his jacket pocket, thumbed it, put it to his ear. "Hello? Yes, this is Tom Norton. Could you put me through to the warden?" "Thank you." Brief pause. Carl took the seat. The table held a slim black data slate cracked open at a discreet angle. No logo. An ultimate in brand statements. Mars Tech. Hard copy lay around, unfamiliar forms. Carl scanned upside-down text. The word release leapt out and kicked him in the heart. Norton offered him a small, distracted smile. "Hello, Warden Paris? Yes, I need your help here. No, nothing serious. I'm just having a little difficulty with one of your men over procedure. Could you? Thank you, that would be ideal." He held out the phone to Garcia. "The warden would like to talk to you." Garcia took the phone as if it might bite him, held it gingerly to his ear. You couldn't hear what Paris said to him. It was a good phone, and the projection cone was tight. But his face flushed as he listened. His eyes switched from Carl to Norton and back like they were 2 parts of a puzzle that didn't fit. He tried to say, "Yes, but," a couple of times, jarred to a halt on each attempt. Paris, it was clear, wasn't in the mood for debate. When Garcia finally got to speak, it was a clenched, "Yes, sir," and he lowered the phone immediately after. Norton held out a hand for it, and Garcia, still flushing, slung it under the other man's reach, onto the surface of the table. It made almost no sound on impact, slid a bare 5 centimeters from where it landed. A very good phone, then. Garcia glared at it, perplexed, maybe by his failure to skid the thing off the edge of the table onto the floor. Norton picked the little sliver of hardware up and stowed it. "Thank you." Garcia stood there for a moment, wordless, staring at Norton. The other CO murmured something to him, put a hand on his arm, was propelling him out when Garcia shook off the grip and stabbed a finger at Carl. "This man is dangerous," he said tightly. "If you can't see that, then you deserve everything you get." The other CO ushered him out and closed the door. Norton gave it a moment, then seated himself adjacent to Carl. Pale blue eyes leveled across the space. The smile was gone. "So," Norton said, "are you dangerous, Mr. Marsalis?" "Who wants to know?" A shrug. "In point of fact, no one. It was rhetorical. We've accessed your records. You are, let's say, quite sufficiently dangerous for our purposes. But I'm interested to know what your perceptions are on the subject." Carl stared at him. "Have you ever done time?" "Happily, no, but even if I had, I doubt it would approximate your experiences here. I'm not a citizen of the Confederated Republic." Light trace of contempt in the last two words. Carl hazarded a guess. "You're Canadian?" The corner of Norton's mouth quirked. "North Atlantic Union. I'm here, Mr. Marsalis, at the behest of the Western Nations Colony Initiative. We would like to offer you a job."
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.